Colombia, a country once known for its breathtaking landscapes, vibrant culture, and rich history, was for a time held hostage by one man, a man who commanded armies without wearing a uniform, who controlled the flow of billions of dollars without ever stepping into a bank. He was a ghost in plain sight, a myth made real. He built hospitals and soccer fields, gave money to the poor, and was adored in slums where the government had never dared to enter. Yet, he also planted bombs in shopping centers, gunned down presidential candidates, and sent thousands to their graves. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and his story is one of the most astonishing and terrifying in modern history. A story of power built on blood, loyalty bought with fear, and a fall as dramatic as his rise. This is not just the tale of a drug lord. This is the rise and fall of a man who defied nations and paid the ultimate price. Pablo Escobar was born on December 1st, 1949, in the town of Rio Negro, nestled in the Antioquia department of Colombia. He was the third of 7 children, raised in the nearby city of Medellin by his mother Hermilda, a schoolteacher, and his father Abel, a modest farmer. His childhood was not one of luxury or opportunity. Like many in rural Colombia, Escobar grew up in the shadow of poverty, in a nation where inequality wasn't just a social issue, it was the fabric of everyday life. But even as a boy, Pablo was different. He had a sharp mind, a calculating instinct, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for something bigger than the dirt roads and small homes of Medellin. By the time he was a teenager, Escobar had already begun to explore the gray areas of morality. He allegedly started by stealing gravestones, scrubbing off the names, and reselling them to counterfeiters. From there, he moved into smuggling cigarettes, stealing cars, and running small scams. He once told a classmate that his dream was to become a millionaire before the age of 22. The 1970s would provide him with the opportunity. The United States was in the midst of a cocaine boom. Demand was surging among elites and celebrities, and supply lines were still fragmented. Escobar saw the gap and moved in like a predator stalking weak prey. At first, he worked as a courier for larger smugglers, flying small amounts of cocaine from Colombia to Panama and then into the U.S. But it didn't take long before he realized he could run his own network, cut out the middlemen, and build something massive. From those early deals, Escobar would begin constructing what would soon become the most powerful drug empire the world had ever seen. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just another player in the drug world. He had transformed into a mastermind, one who saw logistics where others saw chaos and opportunity where others saw danger. Escobar founded what would become the Medellin Cartel, a ruthless and highly efficient drug trafficking organization. At its peak, the cartel was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single day. The operation was global. Cocaine was harvested in remote Colombian jungles, processed in hidden laboratories, then flown in small planes or transported via custom-built narco-submarines, often landing in the Caribbean or Central America before reaching American soil. Escobar even developed an internal air force, a fleet of private jets, helicopters, and small aircrafts, many of them landing on secret runways in the Bahamas and Florida. The profits were mind-boggling. He was bringing in up to $70 million a day. So much cash flooded in, he reportedly spent $2,500 per month just on rubber bands to bundle stacks of bills, and in a twist of absurdity, millions were lost each year to mold, rats, and decay, hidden in walls, buried in fields, or sunk underground for safekeeping. But Escobar wasn't content with wealth alone. He craved influence, power, immortality, so he turned to politics. In 1982, he was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress, part of an effort to legitimize his empire. He gave generously to the poor, building homes, parks, soccer fields, and clinics. In Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, he was viewed not as a criminal, but as a folk hero. He called it Medellin sin tugurios, Medellin without slums. To many, He was doing what the government had long failed to do, but it was a calculated move. Escobar wasn't just buying admiration. He was building a human shield of loyalty. Behind the generosity, his hands were already drenched in blood. By the mid to late 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a criminal. He was a global force, a shadow power operating alongside sovereign nations. His Medellin cartel controlled 80% of the world's cocaine supply, with estimated profits reaching $22 billion a year. To put that in perspective, Escobar made more money than some Fortune 500 companies, and far more than the Colombian government itself. Forbes magazine listed him among the world's wealthiest men, placing a drug trafficker next to tech titans and oil barons. His estate, Hacienda Nápoles, was a symbol of obscene excess, a private zoo with giraffes, hippos, elephants, and ostriches. Classic cars lined the roads. A private bull ring hosted his lavish parties, and a dinosaur sculpture greeted guests at the gates. But behind the wealth and charm was a growing darkness. Escobar had declared war, not just on rival cartels, but on the very foundation of the Colombian state. He targeted judges, prosecutors, police officers, journalists, even presidential candidates. More than 600 law enforcement officials were murdered in a span of a few years. If someone stood in his way, they simply didn't live long. He pioneered a brutal policy known as plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Most took the bribe. Those who didn't often vanished. And yet, despite his cruelty, millions of Colombians still adored him. Why? Because in neighborhoods abandoned by the state, Escobar had stepped in. He gave them homes, food, hope. To them, he was Robin Hood with a mustache. But outside the barrios, chaos reigned. In 1989, Escobar's hitmen planted a bomb on Avianca Flight 203, believing a political rival was on board. The plane exploded mid-air, killing 107 innocent passengers. The same year, he ordered the bombing of a Bogotá police building, killing dozens. Colombia was no longer dealing with a drug trafficker. They were at war with a domestic terrorist, one who operated with billions at his disposal and armies loyal to his voice. By this point, Escobar's legend had crossed borders, and so had his enemies. The United States was watching and preparing to intervene. With the world finally awake to the scale of Pablo Escobar's influence, pressure mounted from all directions. The United States had had enough. American cities like Miami and New York were drowning in cocaine. Violence tied to Escobar's supply chains had reached U.S. soil. In response, the DEA, CIA, and elite military units began assisting Colombian forces with intelligence, training, and surveillance. Their mission: dismantle the Medellin cartel and bring Escobar to justice. But Colombia's government had a major obstacle: extradition. Escobar feared nothing more than being sent to an American prison where his influence, money, and power would vanish. To prevent that, he unleashed one of the most violent terror campaigns in modern history. Over the next few years, presidential candidates were assassinated, court buildings bombed, and journalists hunted in broad daylight. Escobar even placed a $300 bounty on every police officer's head, resulting in the deaths of hundreds. Faced with relentless bloodshed, Colombia's leaders caved. In 1991, the government offered Escobar a stunning deal. He would surrender, avoid extradition, and serve time in Colombia, in a prison of his own design. That prison was called La Catedral, but it was no prison. It was a palace. Perched on a mountaintop overlooking Medellin, La Catedral had a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, and a private disco. Escobar continued to run the cartel from inside its walls, hosting guests, settling disputes, and managing his cocaine empire as if nothing had changed. But then, he made a fatal mistake. In 1992, Escobar ordered the torture and execution of 2 of his lieutenants inside La Catedral. The government, embarrassed and pressured by the U.S., decided to move him to a real prison. That was all Escobar needed to hear. Before authorities could transfer him, he vanished. Once again, he became Colombia's most wanted man. But this time, the rules had changed. The U.S. had fully committed to his capture. The Colombian government formed Search Block, a military police hybrid unit trained specifically to hunt Escobar. But they weren't the only ones after him. A shadowy paramilitary group called Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged. Composed of rival drug lords, former associates, and victims' families, they began systematically murdering anyone linked to Escobar. Lawyers, accountants, relatives. His empire was collapsing from within. The man who once held a nation hostage was now being hunted by the very monsters he had helped create. By late 1993, Pablo Escobar was a man running out of options and out of friends. His cartel had fractured. Most of his allies were either dead, imprisoned, or had turned against him. Los Pepes continued to eliminate his support network with brutal precision, and SearchBlock, aided by U.S. surveillance technology, was closing in. He was constantly on the move, changing safe houses, using relatives to deliver messages, and avoiding phones, except when it came to his most trusted contact, his son, Juan Pablo. That phone call would seal his fate. On December 2, 1993, Escobar made a brief call to his family from a modest rooftop hideout in Medellin. He didn't know the Colombian military, with help from the U.S., had triangulated the signal using radio direction-finding equipment. Within minutes, SearchBlock agents swarmed the neighborhood. As they closed in, Escobar attempted to flee across the rooftops, just like he had in his early days. But this time, there was no escape. A firefight broke out. Escobar was shot in the leg, then the torso, and finally, a bullet struck him behind the ear. He collapsed face down on the red-tiled rooftop, barefoot and bleeding, just meters from freedom. Photos of his lifeless body were splashed across global news outlets within hours. The man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, who had terrorized governments and charmed the poor, was now just another statistic, dead at the age of 44. But even in death, mystery followed. Some believe the fatal shot was self-inflicted. Escobar had always said he'd rather die than be captured. Others insist it was a Colombian sharpshooter who ended his life. The truth? It hardly mattered anymore. The king of cocaine had fallen. Pablo Escobar's death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his influence. His fall shattered the Medellin cartel, but it did not stop the drug trade. Other cartels, particularly in Cali and later Mexico, quickly filled the power vacuum. The flow of cocaine to the United States continued, only with new faces, new methods, and even more violence. In Colombia, Escobar remains one of the most polarizing figures in history. To the families of the judges, police officers, journalists, and politicians he murdered, he is remembered as a mass killer, a terrorist, and a destroyer of a nation's soul. To others, particularly in the slums of Medellin, he is still spoken of in near-religious terms. A Robin Hood, a man of the people, who built homes when the government looked away, who gave hope when there was none. His former estate, Hacienda Nápoles, has been transformed into a theme park. Tourists take selfies next to hippos that have now grown into an invasive species in Colombia's rivers, a strange, living legacy of his excess. Pop culture has cemented his legend. TV shows like Narcos, documentaries, books, and films have made his life into a global fascination. But that fascination often sanitizes the brutal truth. Escobar ordered the deaths of over 4,000 people. He turned entire cities into war zones. He proved that, in the absence of justice and opportunity, one man could rise from nothing and bend an entire country to his will. Yet, in the end, he died the same way he was born, alone, hunted, and barefoot on a rooftop. Escobar's story is not just about drugs or power. It's about the fragility of systems, the cost of corruption, and how quickly order collapses when fear becomes currency. He was not a hero. He was not a demon. He was a man, one who rose far higher than anyone thought possible, and fell just as hard. Pablo Escobar's story is a chilling reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. But behind every empire like his, there are thousands of untold stories of fear, survival, and resistance. If you found this documentary thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to The Knowable Unknown for more deep dives into the lives that shaped history, both in the shadows and the spotlight. Like the video if you want more stories like this, and comment below. Was Escobar a genius criminal, or simply a man in the right place at the wrong time? Let's explore the unknown together.